The topic of today's video is the gold bug. This is a story that is not as well known or highly regarded today as it was in Poe's time, or even 50 years ago. This is due in large part to Poe's handling of race, about which I'll have more to say a little later on. Written in the early 1840s, the story has much in common with Murders in the Rue Morgue and Poe's other tales of ratiocination. But unlike the Dupin mysteries, the plot of The Gold Bug does not revolve around the investigation of a crime. It's a treasure hunting story, first and foremost. A pair of human skeletons are found buried with Captain Kidd's treasure, evidence it would appear of a 150-year-old murder. The remains are casually mentioned by the narrator during the excavation of the site and are the subject of Legrand's disinterested speculation in the last paragraph of the story. A macabre detail, certainly, and typical of Poe, but totally incidental and inconsequential to the main plot, as if Poe were playing with readers' expectations. Look, here's a murder that is not the focus of my tale. The story that immediately preceded The Gold Bug was The Telltale Heart. The next would be The Black Cat, both stories involving murder and both ending with the discovery of the victim's body. The search for buried treasure was a common literary trope in the 19th century, and Poe may have borrowed some elements of his story from Robert Byrd's novel Shepherd Lee, in which the scion of a wealthy Virginia family partners with a former slave to recover Captain Kidd's treasure, which they believe, erroneously it turns out, buried at the base of a tree. Poe gave a generally favorable review of the novel for the Southern Literary Messenger in 1836, and that review will come up again later in this video. Poe originally sold The Gold Bug to Graham's magazine in 1842, but negotiated with Graham to get it back when it looked like he would finally be able to launch his own literary magazine, The Stylus. When this plan fell through, as it always did, he entered it in a story contest sponsored by the Philadelphia Dollar newspaper. This was in the spring of 1843. The $100 prize offered for the best story doubled Poe's winnings for manuscript found in a bottle a decade earlier, and was the most money he ever received up front for a story. The Gold Bug was printed in 2 installments in June 1843 and quickly became his most popular tale during his lifetime. A stage adaptation appeared 2 months later, and it was the first of Poe's stories to be translated into a foreign language and helped establish his reputation in France. In 1980, a television production of The Gold Bug became the first live-action screen adaptation of a Poe story to receive industry accolades, winning 3 Daytime Emmys for children's programming. When Wiley and Putnam published Poe's tales in 1845, they placed The Gold Bug first, as you can see here on the contents page. Appearing in between the Murders in the Rue Morgue, 1841, and the Purloined Letter in 1844, and just 6 months after The Mystery of Marie Roget, The Gold Bug is often discussed alongside Poe's so-called ratiocinative tales. Although not strictly a detective story, there are still several striking resemblances to the Dupin mysteries. In the first place, the narrator bears witness to a series of baffling events that are later explained by a more astute and logically capable male companion whose voice takes over the second half of the tale. This companion, William Legrand, resembles Auguste Dupin in several key respects. First, he's a Frenchman of aristocratic lineage who, having lost his family fortune, adopts the life of an eccentric, indigent recluse. Second, he approaches seemingly intractable problems like Captain Kidd's cipher and the precise location of the buried treasure by applying a careful logic that forms the substance and method of his narration. And finally, he manipulates the narrator, who is a surrogate for the reader, by withholding key information, for example, the MacGuffin of the Gold Bug itself, to maximize the impact of his revelations. A MacGuffin, by the way, is a narrative device, a kind of ruse, sometimes an object, sometimes a person, that motivates characters to act, but that turns out to have far less significance than originally thought. MacGuffins can be used to confuse or misdirect readers too. Writing in 1845, the magazinist Thomas Dunn English, he was a former friend of Poe's and he fell out with him over the Francis Osgood scandal. He observed the bug is used only in the way of mystification, having throughout a seeming and no real connection with the subject. Its purpose is to seduce the reader into the idea of supernatural machinery and keeping him so mystified until the last moment. That is, when Legrand finally discloses the ruse to the bewildered narrator. So while the Goldbug has key points in common with the Dupin stories, there are also some unique themes and motifs. We're going to talk about exploration, race, cryptography, and finally, art and madness. We're going to start with exploration. Poe's best-known stories are often set in uncomfortable, foreboding, enclosed spaces. Think of the clock tower in A Predicament, for instance, or the inquisitorial dungeon in The Pit and the Pendulum, the catacombs in The Cask of Amontillado, the prismatic concatenation of chambers in The Mask of the Red Death, the pentagonal honeymoon suite in Ligeia, and I can go on and on. Even windows, when they are described, enhance the carceral, claustrophobic atmosphere of Poe's fictional world. The view looking out windows matters less than the effect of light passing through to the inside. More often than not, windows serve to occlude, distort, or misdirect. Now, I'm digressing a little bit. My point is that many of Poe's characters are unable to move freely. They're confined in close, artificial environments and spend relatively little time outside in nature. There are, however, a dozen or so stories in which characters do spend a considerable amount of time exploring natural scenery. There are the so-called landscape tales, like The Domain of Arnheim and Lander's Cottage, which we don't have time to read in this class, unfortunately. Then there are the high seas adventure stories like A Descent into the Maelstrom and Manuscript Found in a Bottle, and which we'll be reading those stories next. But The Goldbug is the first story we're reading in which much of the action takes place out of doors. The setting is Sullivan's Island, South Carolina, the site of Fort Moultrie, where Poe had been stationed during his short stint in the Army. The terrain there must have made an impression on him because he includes specific geographical details in his descriptions of the wilderness traversed by Legrand and his companions throughout the course of the story. Here's an example. It was a species of tableland near the summit of an almost inaccessible hill, densely wooded from base to pinnacle, and interspersed with huge crags that appeared to lie loosely upon the soil, and in many cases were prevented from precipitating themselves into the valleys below merely by the support of the trees against which they reclined. Deep ravines in various directions gave an air of still sterner solemnity to the scene. In certain respects, such details are typical of Poe's descriptions elsewhere. The density, the inertia, the solemnity. What's different here is their transfer to the natural world, a world through which he allows his characters to move, though not without considerable effort. Poe pursues this theme in the sea stories I mentioned before, and also in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. We're going to move on now to the topic of race. In recent years, no question has been more urgent and contentious than Poe's beliefs, values, and attitudes on the topic of race, and on slavery in particular. It's a slippery question, first because Poe says relatively little about it, and what public statements he does make must be carefully weighed in the larger context of the antebellum literary marketplace. And because of this ambiguity, we have to be mindful of how our own understanding of race in 21st century America shapes our response to Poe, and be careful to avoid oversimplification and to recognize the limitations of anachronistic standards, assumptions, and definitions. This question is pertinent to The Gold Bug because the story contains Poe's most fully realized black character. There are a few other examples. Pompey, the black dwarf in a predicament, may come to mind. And then there's Seymour, the brutal axe-wielding mutineer in the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. Both these characters have limited parts in their respective stories, but Jupiter plays a pivotal role. He's an agent between Legrand and the narrator. Without him, the narrator really doesn't have much of a story to tell, and he, of course, contributes to the recovery of Captain Kidd's treasure. But he's also a comic figure. Poe expected readers to laugh at Jupiter's superstitiousness, his rustic patois, his verbal malaprops and blunders, all comic traits used to distinguish characters of inferior social rank since Shakespeare's time, and that were not uncommon in the Gothic novels and melodramas of the early 19th century. But these same traits were serviceable in racist caricature as well, popularized in contemporary minstrel shows like Thomas Rice's blackface performance of Jump Jim Crow. And Jupiter's resemblance to such figures would not have gone unrecognized in the 1840s. Early in the story, we learn that Jupiter is an ex-slave of the Legrand family. After his manumission, that's the legal process through which slaves could be freed by their owners, he chose to remain with William as a kind of dutiful servant. This was a common trope of 19th century plantation fiction, which often sentimentalized the master-slave relationship as benevolent and mutually beneficial. More curious, however, is the narrator's speculation that Jupiter's former owners may have encouraged his devotion to William Legrand, not simply because Jupiter depends on the kind offices of a benevolent white master, but because William's eccentricity and waywardness requires the attention of a kind of overseer. It's not improbable, the narrator explains, that the relatives of Legrand, conceiving him to be somewhat unsettled in intellect, had contrived to instill this obstinacy into Jupiter with a view to the supervision and guardianship of the wanderer. This role reversal seems to be confirmed by Legrand himself in a letter addressed to the narrator, in which he confirms Jupiter's earlier report of his inscrutable conduct, his sneaking off in the middle of the night without explanation, which he says has exasperated Jupiter to the point of threatening a kind of punishment reserved for runaway slaves. "I have not been quite well for some days past," he explains, "and poor old Jupe annoys me almost beyond endurance by his well-meant attentions. Would you believe it? He had prepared a huge stick the other day with which to chastise me for giving him the slip and spending the day among the hills on the mainland. I verily believe that my ill looks alone saved me a flogging." Later, when Jupiter fails to follow Legrand's instructions to locate the buried treasure, Legrand berates him with racially inflected insults, calling him an infernal scoundrel and infernal black villain, and he threatens with physical harm. And yet, he never follows through on these threats, and at one point seems embarrassed when Jupiter takes exception to his ill temper. After berating Jupiter for his reluctance to inch out onto the dead branch of the tulip tree, Legrand seems rattled by Jupiter's bold rebuke. Instead of escalating his threats, he yields to Jupiter's common sense and offers remuneration for his effort. "Well, now listen. If you will venture out on the limb as far as you think safe and not let go the beetle, I'll make you a present of $1 as soon as you get down." The racial slur in this exchange is repeated 4 times in the story, and each time it is spoken by Jupiter, indicating his tacit acceptance of Southern white supremacy. The white characters, by contrast, prefer the more genteel, socially accepted term Negro. The epithet used by Jupiter appears in only one other story that I'm aware of, at the conclusion of A Predicament, where it is used by the white character Suki Snobs. But because she's the target of Poe's scathing satire of bad writing, it's hardly dispositive of his latent white supremacy. Given the quantity and variety of Poe's writing, at a time when race and slavery were pressing social and political issues, It is remarkable how infrequently he broached these topics. There were plenty of writers on both sides, pro-secessionist fire eaters as well as abolitionists, who used their literary platform to engage in partisan politics. Beverly Tucker, for example, a regular contributor to the Southern Literary Messenger, published the first secessionist novel, The Partisan Leader, in 1836, as well as a controversial pro-slavery piece, the so-called Paulding-Drayton Review, that for many years was misattributed to Poe. On the abolitionist side, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's Poems on Slavery appeared in 1845, and Harriet Beecher Stowe's bestseller, Uncle Tom's Cabin, appeared in 1852. Despite their political differences, what all these writers had in common, and what distinguished them from Poe, importantly, was their class privilege. Simply put, financial security obviated or negated the potential harm of alienating some of their readers. Poe was not in that position. He struggled to earn a living by his pen and desperately wanted to reach a national audience on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line. He could not afford to embrace partisan causes and risk alienating readers. From Poe's perspective, then, partisan strife was simply bad business. So, was Poe racist? I'd say certainly, but it is important that we understand his racism not simply as bad judgment or a private sin, but as a reflection of 19th century racial norms and attitudes accepted by a majority of white readers of all partisan persuasions. What Poe scholar Terrence Whalen, in the best piece I've read on this topic, calls the average racism of antebellum America. Poe's opinions on slavery are more difficult to pin down, but there's plenty of evidence that he was not sympathetic to abolitionism. His negative opinion of that movement can be gleaned from his anonymous reviews of Longfellow's Poems on Slavery, for example, and Byrd's novel Shepherd Lee, which devotes several chapters to a fictional account of a violent slave uprising stoked by abolitionist propaganda. Just because Poe was hostile to abolition, however, does not mean he looked favorably on slavery. And even if he wasn't opposed to it, he saw no personal advantage to defending it either, and his fiction provides some indication that he was troubled by the treatment of enslaved people. One event that galvanized both sides of the issue was the 1831 slave rebellion led by Nat Turner, which resulted in the slaughter of entire families of white slaveholders. Around 50 to 60 people were killed, nearly half of them small children, and several hundred blacks were killed in the indiscriminate retaliatory violence that followed. The rebellion was the inspiration for the insurrection described in Shepherd Lee, and it probably inspired the terrifying character of Seymour, who leads the mutiny on the Grampus in Poe's narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. But there are more ambivalent echoes in Hop Frog, in which a dwarf, like Pompey in a predicament, has been abducted from his homeland and forced into servitude. He's stripped of his identity and endures physical abuse and repeated humiliation from the king until he finally exacts a just, if rather extreme, revenge, dressing the king and his counselors as apes, binding them in chains and lighting them on fire, and then escaping with his collaborator Trippetta. One might also look at The Black Cat, the story that followed right after The Gold Bug, as an allegory of racial violence, in which a cat disfigured and hanged by his owner returns to exact his ghostly revenge. As racial allegories, these stories may be interpreted, on the one hand, as an examination of the excesses, abuses, and pathology of white power. On the other hand, they also demonstrate Poe's reluctance and elusiveness on racial issues. To what degree he was complicit, apologetic, or sympathetic continues to divide readers and critics. These conversations, they're important and deeply fascinating, but intractable. And ultimately, I think we must be satisfied with asking the questions without ever reaching definitive conclusions. Unfortunately, these thorny questions might account, at least in part, for declining interest in the Gold Bug in recent years. But what contributed the most to its popularity in Poe's time was cryptography. And basically, cryptography is a form of secret writing that translates readable information or plain text into code. And I'm using the word code in its colloquial rather than technical sense here. The system or method is called a cipher. An encrypted message is called a cryptogram. To decrypt the message, one must either possess the key or go to the trouble of reverse engineering the cipher. Cryptographic writing has existed since ancient times and was used to secure military communications, among other things. But with the rise of periodical print publication in the early 19th century, it would become a popular form of entertainment, like word searches or crossword puzzles. And Poe was an early pioneer in the development of this fad. Starting in late 1839, he published a series of articles on cryptography in Charles Alexander's Weekly Messenger, and then later in Graham's magazine. He created cryptograms and challenged readers to solve them, but he also invited readers to devise and submit their own, which he would decrypt and print in the pages of the magazine. This proved to be an effective sales gimmick. The Messenger received dozens of submissions, and by the early months of 1840, cracking these puzzles was taking considerable time and effort and impinging on Poe's other projects. In the end, Poe solved all but one that was submitted, and that would remain a mystery until the year 2000 when it was finally cracked with the aid of a computer. One of the most noteworthy of Poe's articles on cryptography appeared in the July 1841 issue of Graham's magazine. In this essay, titled A Few Words on Secret Writing, Poe explains the basic substitution cipher, in which alphabetical characters are replaced by symbols, and which can be cracked by analyzing the frequency of certain symbols and symbol patterns. He gives two cryptograms submitted by an anonymous reader, the first involving a simple substitution cipher, and the second a more challenging polyalphabetic cipher. A Few Words on Secret Writing appeared in the midst of Poe's Ratiocinative tales, and the two cryptograms he analyzes came in response to a challenge printed in Graham's a few months earlier. The same issue, it so happens, that also contains The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Poe's intense fascination with cryptography during this period explains why it features so prominently in The Gold Bug, which he first offered to Graham in 1842. And the popularity of his columns on this topic explains, at least in part, why The Gold Bug, why the tale was such a success when it finally appeared in 1843. In the story, Captain Kidd's cryptogram is accidentally discovered by Legrand during a conversation with the narrator on the topic of the curious gold-colored beetle that he and Jupiter caught the day before. I'm not going to delve into the specific details of that conversation just yet. What's important is the cryptogram, which I'll put up here on screen, which uses a simple substitution cipher to conceal the precise location of Kidd's treasure. Using frequency analysis, Legrand identifies the numerical character 8 as the equivalent of the letter E, and knowing the location of double letters, EE, will significantly reduce the list of possible words, as you'll see in a moment. Next, he looks for a repeated three-character sequence ending in 8, knowing that it is likely to be the word the, T-H-E, which now gives him two additional letters, T, indicated by a semicolon, and H, indicated by the number 4. If we look to the end of the third line of the cryptogram, we see the word the, followed by a semicolon, which we now know is the letter T, which must be the first letter of the next word. The T is followed on the next line by an opening parenthesis and then the double E. As Legrand explains, the only four-letter word in the English language that starts with the T and ends with EE is tree, which reveals yet another letter, R. With four letters now identified, E, T, H, and R, we can begin to make headway in solving the cryptogram, which Legrand finally does, of course, revealing the riddle of the treasure's location. Legrand's analysis of Kidd's cryptogram and his solution of the riddle is as much an exercise in ratiocination as Detective Dupin's identification of the murderer of Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter, or the location of the purloined letter. And yet, throughout the tale, the narrator interprets Legrand's inscrutable manner and behavior as evidence of incipient madness, not unlike the narrator in The Murderers in the Rue Morgue when he speculates on Dupin's diseased intelligence. Dupin tells his companion that most men wear windows in their bosoms, windows through which one might gaze into the heart of a man. The narrator lacks Dupin's extraordinary powers of observation and deduction, and the narrator of The Gold Bug suffers the same limitations. He can't penetrate into the mystery of Legrand's bizarre statements and behavior. His observation is too nearsighted, too narrow. One might say he lacks imagination, and this brings me to my last topic, art and madness. At one point, speaking of Legrand, the narrator tells us, "I had no alternative but to conclude him stricken with lunacy." And this is a conclusion he restates several times throughout the story. Of course, by the end, Legrand later reveals that he's no lunatic. For true madness, we may look to another character, Roderick Usher, who is all imagination in the absence of reason. But Legrand and Usher do have at least one thing in common. They are both artists. The one a painter of morbid, phantasmagoric visions, the other more of a scientific illustrator who's insulted when the narrator impugns the accuracy of his drawing of the gold bug. The narrator says, "This is a strange scarabaeus, I must confess. Never saw anything like it before. Unless it was a skull or a death's head, which it more nearly resembles than anything else that has come under my observation." "A death's head?" echoed Legrand. Yeah, well, it has something of that appearance upon paper, no doubt. The two upper black spots look like eyes, and the longer one at the bottom like a mouth, and then the shape of the whole is oval." "Perhaps so," said I, "but Legrand, I fear you are no artist. I must wait until I see the beetle itself, if I am to form any idea of its personal appearance." "Oh, I don't know," said he, a little nettled. "I draw tolerably, should do it at least, have had good masters, and flatter myself that I am not quite a blockhead." "But, my dear fellow, you are joking then," said I. "This is a very passable skull. Indeed, I may say that it is a very excellent skull, according to the vulgar notions about such specimens of physiology, and your scarabaeus must be the queerest scarabaeus in the world if it resembles it." This testy exchange and Legrand's reaction to the narrator's criticism of his drawing of the beetle is the moment when the narrator begins questioning Legrand's mental stability. Later, during the treasure hunt, Legrand's odd behavior, seemingly ludicrous demands, and violent outbursts toward Jupiter provide further plain evidence of my friend's aberration of mind. As in The Fall of the House of Usher, the narrator links madness with imagination and pathology. I made no doubt that Legrand had been infected with some of the innumerable Southern superstitions about money buried, and that his fantasy had received confirmation by the finding of the scarabaeus, or perhaps by Jupiter's obstinacy in maintaining it to be a bug of real gold. A mind disposed to lunacy would readily be led away by such suggestions, especially if chiming in with favorite preconceived ideas. And like the narrator of The House of Usher, who senses that he himself has been infected with Roderick's diseased imagination, the narrator of The Gold Bug also feels himself succumbing to Legrand's influence. We see this after their first failed attempt to find the treasure, when Legrand recalibrates, accounting for Jupiter's error, and they resume digging. We again set to work with the spades. I was dreadfully weary, but scarcely understanding what had occasioned the change in my thoughts, I felt no longer any great aversion from the labor imposed. I had become most unaccountably interested, nay, even excited. Perhaps there was something amid all the extravagant demeanor of Legrand, some air of forethought or of deliberation, which impressed me. I dug eagerly, and now and then caught myself actually looking with something that very much resembled expectation for the fancied treasure, the vision of which had demented my unfortunate companion. Of course, the difference between the two stories, The Fall of the House of Usher and The Gold Bug, is that in the former, Roderick really is in the throes of madness, and the light from his windows casts a lurid glow over the narrator's own mind, whereas in the latter story, Legrand's sanity is confirmed by the discovery of Captain Kidd's treasure and the full disclosure of his motives and methods, which are, of course, quite rational. And I think it was this moral, the triumph of reason over a seemingly insoluble mystery, paired with extraordinary material rewards, like well over $1.5 million that they find. I think this accounted for much of the tale's extraordinary success when it appeared in 1843. And this juxtaposition of reason and madness with imagination as the permeable membrane between them is, I think, the very essence of Poe's narrative art.